my shit together. I won't blame you.
Okay.
And I'm starting it up right now. Let's see how we do here. And as usual, I'll be very confused the entire time while we get set up. So shocking nobody. So it did it again. All right. Hey, will you send me the link of the new
Yeah, let me.
That's apparently the only way that I know how to get. Hey, everybody, we're on. If you can see us. And I can't see your chats yet, but Kira's going to help us out. We're a little bit late today because of me. And we're going to talk about that. I've got really moody lighting, which is good. And I'm wearing a very warm hat. Kira, you're crushing the pink today.
Well, so let me, as we're talking about kind of being a mess, right before we were supposed to go on, I like went into the bathroom to do kind of a last minute check, and I had lipstick all over my teeth.
Oh yeah. Okay, send me the link so that I can
watch
this craziness.
Looking for it.
So that I can see you all and who's with us. For some reason, y'all, when we first get started, when we very first get started, I have issues finding the chat, and I need my friend Kira to help me out. Otherwise, it doesn't work. And my friend Nancy's hooking me up.
Okay, I was gonna say I can't find it.
On it. We're on it. Okay. Oh, look, here's everybody. Guys, I'm so sorry for being late. Let me start. There's our chat. Let me make sure I get the chat out so I can look at it and keep talking to y'all. So let me start with the most with the clearest statement, which is us being late is totally my fault. And Kira, as she already mentioned, had her was already ready to go, had cleaned the lipstick off of her teeth like a champ.
Yeah.
And but it's funny because I got a message from our friend Kathy Baggett saying, "Hey, I'm online. Let me know when you're here," or something. And I was like, "Oh, shucks." So essentially what happened was, for reasons that I don't understand, because I keep my own calendar, today was not on my calendar, which is weird because it's on my calendar as a recurring event every week. So I'm not sure how that changed. But when it changed, and it wasn't on my calendar, if something's not on my calendar, I don't know about you, Kira, but I forget. Like if like waking up, if I didn't have an alarm, I wouldn't wake up. If I didn't go to sleep on my calendar, I would never fall asleep. Like I don't do well without calendars literally telling me every single thing I need to do.
Yeah.
So I don't know if that's the same situation for you, but I sure do apologize for the whole group. Hi, Betsy. Good morning, Leslie. Good morning, Mary. Good morning, Kathy, and everyone else who's joining us. We got Kira back, who has a special guest of her own.
I do. This is Wallace.
Hi, Wallace. Hello, Wallace. Like a good cat, ignoring anyone who talks to him. That's.
The cats have been a little bit clingy lately, so I don't really know. They're,
Yeah. So I'm going to start by, so I'm not a bad person, right? But probably, but do you ever feel like do you ever feel about yourself like I'm not probably a bad person, but sometimes I'm bad at being a person?
Oh yeah, I talk about this a lot with my spouse, how like that realization, like when you became an adult and you realized that adults did not have it together. Like, because as a kid you were like, they know what's going on.
Yep.
They are in charge. They're in control. And then you became an adult and you're like, oh no, nobody knew what was going on.
So there's a weird step, there's a weird middle step, right? Which is, it's basically the adolescence. Adults have it together and we don't. And then you realize that your parents don't have it together. And you're like, oh, they must be bad at being adults. What's their problem?
Yeah.
And then you realize, oh no, that's just people.
Yeah.
Right? Like, and I actually think that part of growing up is the constant reevaluation of this reality. Like you have to keep reminding yourself that in fact there's not going to be a point in which you have it all together. Which is I'm a huge fan of Frozen, the movie, and particularly and so while while this is a controversial opinion, I think Frozen 2 is also a classic. And there's a song in Frozen 2 where the snowman sings, Olaf sings, "This'll all make sense when I am older."
Yes.
Right. And like and obviously the beauty of it is like, no, my friend, none of this will ever make sense.
No.
None of it will ever make sense. And the best thing about that character, Olaf, is that while nothing ever makes sense to him, he understands like what actually matters, which is to hold on to people and be loving. Like the understanding is not the thing. So thank you for being understanding, or not understanding, but being understanding and kind. We were going to talk more this week about your book.
Yeah.
And we were going to start with what we ended with last week. I'm going to remind everybody that my friend, and now you've been my guest. Is this the third week in a row?
Something like that. Yeah. I mean, you took a week off.
So 3 weeks that we've done it and you've been on.
Yeah.
I think I'm just going to keep asking Kira back. I enjoy this so much more when she's with us. Okay. Not that I don't love you all, but Kira brings us, it's just awesome to have you be a part of this. Okay. Kira, you wrote a book.
I did.
I think everyone that's with us right now was with us before, but for those who maybe check in later, Kira, you wrote a book called Pro-Choice and Christian. And we talked a lot about sort of, I think last week, and people can tune in. You can watch the ones if you're not watching live, you can always go back and watch the ones. They're all on our YouTube channel. And Kira, you talked a little bit about putting that book together and sort of how it came about and how you didn't mean to become the pro-choice priest.
Yeah.
But how that sort of came about. We talked a little bit about my own personal sort of what my journey is with that, which I want to acknowledge from the outset. On one hand, who cares what a guy's journey is around this stuff? On the other hand, we are 48% of the population and control a lot of things. And sadly, you have to deal with what we think about it. So you want as many of us to change our minds as possible and to get our heads around this and to recognize that women's voices need to be heard. Men need to figure this out, I think. So as annoying as it is that we spent some time thinking about my own journey, I do think that's part of the process long term. You want to convince as many people as possible that this is an important thing for us to be paying attention to. And then we got a little bit into, and I could keep going into over and over again, that for you, as you wrote this, in the last chapter of your book, breaks open this conversation about legislating abortion for a Christian and where a Christian should be in this, really opens up to the whole concept of what it means to really live in a way that is pro-life, that is about supporting and caring for life, promoting life, and protecting life, not just in the womb, but throughout, from cradle to grave, so to speak, and how our culture, if we're serious about being pro-life, needs to do that. And I got to, like, your last chapter, like, to make the conversation around abortion rights and unborn children and women's bodies and all of this, to not make it, but to recognize how it actually becomes I don't even know how to describe it, a lens through which you can see all of it. We're going to get to Albert's question very quickly, but I almost want to ask, like, was that a revelation for you as well? Or did you kind of know going in that this issue, we know it's a big issue. We know that abortion's a hot top button issue. But when you started working on this, did you have a sense that it was going to end up informing so much of your overall theology, or like that it would be touched on so many things?
Yeah, not exactly. I mean, I think I kind of talked a little bit about this last week in terms of, I think oftentimes the conversation around abortion tends to stay very narrow.
Yeah.
And as I was kind of working on the book, I was like, oh, this isn't just a conversation around, like, when does personhood start? Or, like, should this thing be legal? Or, the kind of, like, not that those are unimportant questions,
Right.
but when we look at, like, why wouldn't a woman want to have a baby? Or why would
Right.
why would an unplanned pregnancy be a hardship? Then you're looking at broader cultural,
Right.
political, sociological, theological
Yes.
issues.
Because then you're looking at those reasons. And I was raised thinking basically those reasons were that a woman had been sort of loose with her body and regretted some things she did and didn't want to face the consequences. That's how I was basically taught to understand abortion. Which when I look back on it is, what's that word? Misogynistic. You know, you and I were having a conversation off camera last week where I began to realize that I keep thinking that like being pro-choice and Christian is radical because that's what because the norm of Christian conversation, even though I think the majority of Christians in America find themselves somewhere on the pro-choice spectrum, somewhere on there should be some forms of legal anyways. But the reality is, I think like what I was taught growing up was the radical thing. That like what's a radicalized point of view is that a woman shouldn't have a say in what's going on with her body. Like the idea that that's the norm means that our culture is a radicalized culture that doesn't recognize something like basic. And this is coming through the abortion conversation. And so, of course, we as Christians do that thing where we just never talk about abortion at all. Yeah. Like mainline Christians.
Especially in the mainline, because it is so fraught, because there are some of those issues of like, well, we're not like those Christians.
Right.
So we're just kind of gonna like avoid the topic. Like we're not outside of Planned Parenthood with signs or,
right.
You know, that kind of like, it's just a much quieter conversation. But I think as a clergy person, I would assume, I mean, just based on statistics, that there are people in my congregation who have had abortions. There are people in the pews in your pews, in my pews, who have had abortions. And if we say nothing about it, you know, what kind of message does that send?
Yeah, I mean, it's a third rail.
Yeah,
it's electric.
Something to say, like, and this is sort of the point of the book. There's something in between. It's okay, everything's all good, you know, and it was a sin, and you're a horrible person for ever having an abortion.
Right. That there might actually be some gray area is not the right term for it for me. It's not gray. Like it's just complex, right? Yeah. Like it's like gray means to me like blah. Yeah. Like, but it's like an indefinable, but it's more like contextual and relational. And those things aren't gray at all to me. They're really profoundly complicated and beautiful.
Yeah. And I don't know if you've ever been in this situation, but I certainly have, where I have made a decision that was a very, very hard decision to make. And I knew in my heart of hearts it was the right decision. And there was still grief around that decision.
Oh, yeah. Oh,
and so yes. I think, like, you know, like you can grieve something and still have it be that's the right decision.
I feel like the older I get and like the further along in this ministry I get, there's a lot more of those than not. I mean, when you put it in those terms, Kira, geez. No, I mean, like, that's like, like, I've never, like, thank you for that. That's huge for me. Like, of course. Did you make this decision that you hated making and you knew it was the right decision and you hated it? Yeah. Did you grieve the decision? Yeah. Do you regret it? No.
Yeah.
Well, no, that's not how it works. No, that's exactly how it works. Like, that's what so much of growing up. See, we think growing up is making it here on time and always being at the right thing, right? Growing up is like making a terrible decision that you have to make, feeling bad about it, and then saying, and I would do it again if I had to, through tears. Like that's, and then really growing up is figuring out how to like hold that in any real way without falling apart or becoming, you know, a total disaster or a hypocrite, like just genuinely. Leslie asks, but should we be standing outside of Planned Parenthood with signs? counter protest to support our fellow humans seems like it would go a long way to making those people feel loved. I drove by. I had to go to the hospital yesterday. My first visit to the hospital, by the way, since the pandemic began, to do last rites for someone who had COVID. So that was a thing.
Yeah.
And I'm going in with all that in my heart. And on the way to Christ Hospital, and anyone who lives in Cincinnati knows, on the way to Christ Hospital, you drive right by a Planned Parenthood clinic. And they have the protesters on a rotation. They're not even like mad about it. They're just there like doing like punching the clock and standing there with their dead baby sign. And I was so like on my way to this thing and seeing that. And I was just like, I actually thought exactly what Leslie was saying. Like, should we be counter protesting? But then I thought like, I don't know. What's your take on that?
So the common wisdom is actually that counter protesting is not very helpful if our goal is to support people that are going into Planned Parenthood for whatever reason they're going into Planned Parenthood. Maybe they're not even there for reproductive issues or whatever.
Right.
But because in that moment, all you see are people with signs.
That's right.
And you don't really have a situation where you're like parsing what the signs say,
okay,
or who's yelling what. There are just people yelling, people holding signs, and that's terrifying. And so I do know very faithful Christians who they find part of their ministry is being sort of escorts at places like Planned Parenthood, who will go out. They've got, reflective vests on to sort of identify themselves, or other kind of, identifying gear. And they will like walk out to the car, meet you there, just kind of talk to you, get you comfortable, and sort of like walk you into the building so that you're sort of, you're not running, you're running the gauntlet alone, so to speak. So
I thought about that too. And I thought about, so have you ever been to a pride parade?
Yeah.
And I thought about, I didn't march in it, but I did stand on the side with a sign, and I was wearing I wore a cassock, which for those of you who don't know what that is, that's like the long black robe that makes you look like Neo from the Matrix, or Snape from Harry Potter. And I had a sign that said, "You are a blessing." And the response that I got was so strong, like not being in the march, but on the side as a person in clergy uniform, like blessing this thing. Like there was this powerful, palpable response of like people would look and they'd go like, you could see their faces of like, oh no, clergy with a sign.
Mm-hmm.
And then they'd see the sign and it would shift dramatically. The reason I bring all this up is like, I thought about like, what would it be like to be one of those escorts, but like to wear your collar, like, and maybe even soak up some of the hate that is directed towards the person that's just trying to get in, but anyhow, well, we're skipping ahead a little bit. I want to talk a little bit about what Christians can do, but Albert's question from last week, which I should have available. Let's see if I can find it for us. I wonder if you have it written down somewhere. I feel bad. I was supposed to have it written down.
I don't. I'm gonna like. I do sort of remember the gist of it, so I apologize if I don't get the wording exactly right. But it was something along the lines of, how does the sin of abortion sort of atone for the sins of society or sins of poverty? They don't like cancel each other out, or one doesn't sort of excuse the other. And I would basically say that it doesn't. I mean, but I think we cannot be surprised when we've created a very sinful society and then people make bad choices. Or
so here's the question. Our society has sinned by failing to provide for a pregnant woman. How is the social sin of her and her child's poverty absolved by abortion? And Albert says, to me, it seems compounded, right? So for him, it's, well, this just makes it worse, not better.
Yeah.
So sorry. So I didn't want to interrupt, but I wanted to make sure we had his question
No,
as
no, thank you for getting the wording of that
right.
right. Like, I don't, I guess I wouldn't necessarily parse them out specifically in terms
Sure.
of whether it's compounded or absolved or whatever. I think we're just looking at a very complex, difficult decision, and then we shouldn't be surprised when people make complex, difficult choices. I mean,
Right.
sort of in the same way that we might look at like something like divorce. Like, obviously divorce, you don't want to see divorce. You don't want to see couples get divorced, especially in a Christian context. And like with abortion, Christians get divorced at about the same rates as non-Christians. And so what does
Right.
that sort of say about our witness?
Right.
And yet we know that there are, contexts in which maybe divorce is the faithful option, or maybe the divorce is the most life-giving option, even though, like I was kind of saying earlier, even though it's a bad option.
So can I respond like just to that part and then give it back to you?
Yeah.
My parents split up when I was 13. My dad was gay. He stayed in the closet. He did the whole thing where he tried, literally, like, told me the story, like, if I have kids, maybe God will make me like get rid of this part, because he was like super religious. Like, if I have kids, then God will make me straight. I'll stop feeling, because they didn't even think about God will make me straight. God will take away this thing from me, right? Didn't work, of course, because he's gay, and that's how God made him, it turns out. So my parents split up. And we would think of divorce as a bad thing, you and I, generally, like in the sense of not a fun thing, not like woohoo.
Yeah.
Although one comedian I saw who had gotten a divorce pointed out, it's not, he said, you've never seen a happy couple get a divorce.
Yeah.
So like, it's not like people are like had a great time and then divorced in the middle of having a great time. But I get it. But I do get, like, divorce is painful. It is traumatic. And it is oftentimes, and in my mind, the result of sin in the broader context of how the scriptures describe sin. Not that moment of making the decision of a divorce is a sin or the result of a specific action necessarily, but of a broader reality.
Yeah.
But so we would say divorce is not good. We don't like it. So my parents should have stayed together then. But I don't think that. And I don't, and by the way, I was traumatized by their divorce. I don't know any children who aren't traumatized by their parents' divorce. And I still say that was the best decision they could have made, because you know what else was traumatic? Being in that house.
Together. Yeah.
Profoundly traumatic. Yeah. Yeah. And I had a friend come out recently and say, and he has kids, and he was like, am I messing up my kids? And I was like, oh, buddy, yeah, of course you are. Yeah. I was like, not as much as you'd be messing them up if you'd stayed in the closet and stayed married. That would have been really, really because that would have messed them up on like levels that wouldn't even be able to be unpacked. Right. So, but the argument I've always made, Kira, is like, but if you end this life, you're not giving it any chances. You're not giving it any options. And so that's part of that was always the pardon the language in this day and age. That was always my trump card, like in the conversation. I'm not playing it right now because I kind of done playing the cards on it. I think I really do want to move us to a place of discussion. Yeah. But how do you, when you are interacting with someone who's like, but it's taking a life, like, how do you, I don't know, how do you, like, where do you go in your head? Where do you go in your heart when you're interacting positively and lovingly with someone who has that sincere response?
I mean, I think this is going to hopefully very smoothly lead into kind of where we wanted to go today.
Yeah.
Which is like how, if you take somebody, a human being, a person who is faced with an unplanned pregnancy and the variety of other whatever else is going on in that person's life, whether it's poverty, whether it's potentially losing a job, or how do we pay for healthcare, or who's going to help me raise this child, or all, whatever, all of those questions. I think the question then becomes, how do we make keeping that life and supporting that life a feasible option given everything else that's going on? How do we as Christians, how do we as the church, how do we make keeping that life, supporting that life, the better option? You know, and I think that's where this for me comes down to, because I don't know how this has actually happened in Episcopal context I've been in, where somebody has had a pregnancy outside of marriage and they've then been fired. They've decided to keep the child and they've been fired.
Yeah.
That
would totally happen in the church.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, if you're a priest, yeah.
Right. And or even, I mean, this was
but if you're not, right.
A lay worker.
Yeah.
And to me, that seems so counterproductive.
It's punitive.
And if you wanted somebody to, you know, or the option is, well, if we just keep this quiet and we terminate the pregnancy, then I can just live my life as if nothing happened. Whereas I mean, I just feel like colloquially, as a culture, as a church, whatever, we should be holding up people who go through with unplanned pregnancies as heroes.
Right. But then instead we're just like, we just shame them for having a child out of wedlock.
Yeah.
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 Well, and even if we say, oh, well, I didn't shame that particular person, we perpetuate a culture that shames people for that.
Yeah. Oh, and I feel myself do it internally when I meet somebody or.
Right. Oh, totally. And we, I mean, our culture, I mean, it's even stuff like our culture, basically the American Christian culture that has been really pushed by a specific sort of brand of Christian, really has figured out a way to create an environment where the expectation is that you will be, first of all, that you'll be cisgender and heterosexual. Secondly, that you will not have sex until you are married. Thirdly, once you have sex when you are married, you will have sex, frankly, whenever you're supposed to, which is whenever the man wants to. And then you will have children. You will have children. If you don't, that's your fault too. And I remember that. And so all of that's promoted within the culture by the way, as Christian, which that's a whole other conversation you and I could have. I mean, that's a future conversation is, you know, where does that come up? But anyways, and so anything that's not that, we shame and we try to make it harder, and we go like abstinence only sex education so I went to a private Christian high school for 2 years, and I took health class, and our sex education was taught by a self-professed 70-year-old virgin who showed us a movie, an after-school special made for TV movie starring Dermot Mulroney and Patricia Arquette called Daddy, where they were a high school couple and he was a cellist studying for Juilliard, and they had sex once and she got pregnant. And there were some classic lines but I thought you couldn't get pregnant the first time, and things like that. We only did it once, and she got pregnant, and they kept the baby. And he was supposed to be he was literally had an audition for Juilliard, and the movie ends with him flipping burgers so that he can pay for that kid. Watching that movie was our sex education. That's not made up. That's a thing that happened to me growing up.
Yeah.
So it's just so hard to have a conversation about how we should treat women and unborn children, fetuses, however we want to describe the pre-birth life. without talking about the context of just how disastrous our sexual ethic and culture is. Right.
Yeah, and it really, I think, differs some by class, but the message that I got growing up was, as a high achieving sort of upper middle class person, the message I got was similar in that if you have an unplanned pregnancy, you will ruin your life.
Right.
You will not be successful. And
right.
Success is judged in a very particular way.
Yeah. Yep. Betsy Berry, longtime listener. Can you see her question on the side?
I can't. Have not been able to find.
How do I show it to you? Here, I'll give you the. I'm going to give you the link to it. Okay.
Yeah, I'll the link in there.
I'm going to send this to you because I want you to be able to see it. Click on that and tell me if you get it.
Okay.
Well, look at us with our fancy pants technology.
Yeah. All right. Yeah.
You got it? I'll read while you're looking for it.
Okay, got it.
Betsy says, having been put up for adoption years ago, I am very grateful for the decision my mother made. And I think we should absolutely talk about adoption in this conversation.
Yeah.
My sister-in-law, after whom my son is named, my boy Reed, is named after Virginia Reed. She was adopted at birth. She and my brother have in turn adopted 2 children. So adoption is a big part of my life. Mm-hmm. Has shaped our family forever. And I think, and I know for many people it has been huge. I get when you see Betsy's comment, which by the way, Betsy, I am also very grateful for the decision your mother made. Yeah. You are such a gift to this world and to our community. How do we talk about adoption while talking about abortion?
So adoption, especially within the abortion conversation, is kind of frequently posited as like just go for adoption, which is certainly an option. And it's an option that maybe we should talk about more than we do. And sort of, some of what you were saying last week about we do need to acknowledge, one, the physical demand on a pregnant person's body that pregnancy is. And second of all, in the adoption conversation, I want to acknowledge that adoption itself is a trauma. And while again, it can be the best option given whatever circumstances there are, it's not kind of just an easy solution to every problem.
Right.
And it's particularly complex, as I was doing the research for the book, fascinatingly, particularly in cultures of color, whether that's Black or Latinx or whatever, pregnant people who decide to carry the pregnancy to term often end up actually keeping the child.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's not actually a decision of like, well, do I, put the baby up for adoption? Do I terminate the pregnancy? Do I keep the baby? Whatever. It basically becomes either abortion or keeping the child. So it's a complicated conversation. And again, the way often that adoption is handled in the US is sometimes fraught. Whether you're using an agency, whether you're doing a private adoption. There's
my brother was extorted.
Yeah.
And I say that word not lightly.
Yeah.
Extorted for tens of thousands of dollars. After, and I'll just stop at that. It was bad. So they had one very positive experience with the adoption and one very negative one. They had a positive experience overall with these 2 amazing sons, but but it is a fraught process.
Yeah. And I do like, and that's again, part of the kind of broader systemic conversation is like, well, if we could actually sort of fix adoption or, make adoption a better option, that would go a long way to, not ending abortion necessarily, but sort of giving people the option of life, of keeping, of bringing that pregnancy to fruition.
That framework is really helpful for me, Kira. The difference between how do we stop abortions and how do we promote life and create the best opportunities, like how do we make it as reasonable as possible for someone to be able to bring a child into the world, not just when they are, sorry, I don't know if you can hear my dog drinking water in the background, but he is very much, if you were like, what does that sound? I'm recording from home today by accident. And I have the thirstiest dog in the world and I'm right by the, and you can't tell a dog to stop drinking water. That seems rude.
Yeah.
Anyways, that sound is really obnoxious though. And if I didn't explain it, you guys would be like, what is happening over there?
I was like, that sounds like a dog drinking water.
That's fair. Yeah. I mean, I guess it's a very specific sound, isn't it? I'm going to mute myself, but I want to ask, moving towards how do we acknowledge the beauty of one thing and be grateful for people who've carried babies to term and given them up for adoption, or made the hard decision to raise them themselves, even when, how do we acknowledge the beauty in that without shaming people who've made a different decision? It seems like it's almost like it doesn't have to be either or.
Right.
Right. I just keep coming back to my friends saying to me, if you are a woman and you are pregnant, you absolutely have no idea what the outcome is going to be.
Yeah.
For yourself and your body. And the idea that when someone's put in that position, I know what's better for them than they do.
Mm-hmm.
Is frankly, pardon the political term, un-American. I don't know if it's un-Christian. It's certainly un-American. But I don't know. Anyways.
Yeah, I mean, I think in this conversation, we just need to realize that we never really understand the fullness of someone else's experience.
Right.
And I mean, gosh, that's true of our own, the people that are closest to us, the people, our spouses, the people that we live with, we never fully understand their entire lived experience. And, I've kind of made the comment, for me, if I were to all of a sudden be dealing with an unplanned pregnancy or, facing a really difficult issue, right now in my life, I have the resources to be able to handle that bump in the road. I have parents who live nearby who, can help out. I have, just a variety of resources.
Yeah.
But I hope maybe she won't see this or know that I'm using her as an example. But I mean, for example, my best friend is a professor of music theory at Colorado State University. And she has some health stuff, ranging from vertigo to nausea, kind of chronic illnessy kind of stuff that is not very easily diagnosed. And one of her fears is if she were to get pregnant, she might be so ill during the whole of that pregnancy that she would not be able to work, to teach, to write, to do all of the things that she has to do in order to get tenure and, have a stable job. And so, there are so many things. And if you looked at her body of work, you would not know that was an issue for her.
Right.
So that's just a very small example of you have no idea sort of what people
are going through, which we all know if we just are honest with ourselves about it. Right.
Yeah. And do some people use abortion just as birth control? Yeah. Yeah, they do.
Yes.
And
And we're allowed to have feelings about that.
yeah.
Yeah.
So you get it, I mean, especially in sort of the legal and political conversation, you get into, well, people use this thing badly, therefore nobody should have access to it. And that's a real
Right.
iffy line. And of course, there used to be sort of these panels at hospitals who would determine whether your reason for abortion was good enough. And these
Right.
panels were always made up of men. And
Right.
and depending on whether you got a friendly panel or a, more strict panel could make the difference.
And what if for the next 100 years, when it came to both hospitals and legislatures, only women were allowed to make the decisions about this specifically? How might it shape it? And it's not like all women are pro-choice.
No.
But the conversation would be different.
Yes. Yeah. And I think that's really the goal of the book, is to mostly just change the conversation, or attempt to change the conversation.
Yeah, participate in the changing by modeling having different conversations around it. And you had mentioned, I'm wondering if, based on some of the stuff you wrote, if some of the people who are more adamantly pro-choice, pro-reproductive rights, if you ever heard from them wishing that you'd gone further, or had gone, like, I don't know if that's an experience you've had. I know with the pro-life folks, obviously your book title, they're like, well, you're just, you're done. But not everybody. That's not a fair statement. Some people may have been very open-minded and wanted to hear from you.
Mm-hmm.
But you go a place that, that we haven't heard a lot of Christians go publicly. Did you get have you so far gotten any feedback that was a little bit critical, like, we would have liked you to have been more, like, gone further?
More, not directly, but I will say that, like, I've not been invited to, like, speak about the book at, Planned Parenthood gatherings,
right,
or other kind of reproductive rights,
right,
spheres.
Yeah.
Because I actually don't think abortion is good.
Right.
I would absolutely say that I am not pro-abortion, whereas I think people that really do see it as a good, in a way that I'm not. I mean, I will say, like I said earlier, that it can be the right decision, but that doesn't mean that it's good at its essence.
Making that distinction is important.
Yes, to me.
Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and as it would, and guys, if we think that she's splitting hairs, I don't mean guys, shouldn't say guys colloquially. I don't mean men. Folks, if we think that she's splitting hairs, all you have to do is think about, like, do we think that killing people is good? And it's like, no, we think it's bad. Do we think there are instances when it was necessary? Like, I'm not pro-war. It's really hard to make the argument against going to war with Nazi Germany. You can make it. One can make the argument. It's a really hard argument to really buy into. So you can be like, I don't like war. War is bad, always. And also, here's some times when we thought it was the right thing to do. Right?
And like with war, I think that the court of Christian position around abortion should be, we need to take it very seriously. If this is something that we are considering, or that somebody is considering, or we're talking with somebody who is considering it, it's not necessarily the worst possible decision, but we do need to take it seriously.
Not treat it lightly. So then let's talk about being mainline Christians. The term mainline's dumb, but let's talk about being neither evangelical fundamentalist, or Pentecostal, nor being Roman Catholic, right? Mm-hmm. Or Orthodox. We've often, Methodists, Episcopalians, Presbyterians, some Lutherans, some Baptists fall into this sort of broad spectrum. And we are the ones who oftentimes historically have actually had a pretty large place in government and in political, in public opinion. And we are notoriously silent on abortion. Our churches tend to skew pro-choice, and we are notoriously silent on abortion and reproductive rights. That in my congregation, I've had people before I personally found myself sort of identifying as pro-choice for whatever, and we've talked about the dumbness of those terms, but just for lack of a better term, people just assuming I was because I was an Episcopal priest.
Oh yeah, yeah.
But not because I'd said anything about it, because I guarantee you I hadn't said anything about it. And I remember I was on Commission on Ministry in Los Angeles, which is the group of people who sort of do the gladiator thumbs up, thumbs down on whether someone gets to go to the next level of ordination or not. And there was a person who was in the I was new, I was, green behind the ears. And there was a person who was going through the ordination process who worked for Planned Parenthood in Los Angeles and was going for ordination at the diaconate. And I was bothered that in the conversation in the room, what he did for a living didn't come up.
Mm.
But it was my first meeting and I was like new, and I wasn't gonna be like, are we gonna talk about this? Because Los Angeles is a very politically and theologically liberal diocese.
Mm-hmm.
And so in between sessions, I went up to one of the people who was sort of my mentor and was like, do we just not is it not even I'm not saying I vote against the guy. Seems and I didn't vote against him, and that's confidential, but I didn't vote against him, and he's a deacon in the church and blah, blah, blah. But I was like, is it weird that we're not even discussing this? That it's just a given? That everyone's on the same page about this? And the guy was just sort of my mentor-ish person was sort of like, yeah, you should probably keep your mouth shut about this one. You're new. That's not what he said at all. He was very, very careful. That's what he meant.
That was the subtext of
the subtext was, it's probably a smart move for you just to kind of hang out and be new and listen in this particular case. Because I didn't want to be pigeonholed as that guy, right? But it all calls to mind, what do we do? And Leslie brings it up in her questions. How do we counteract the reputation of the Christians with the signs they're giving the church as a whole? How do we not be the Christians who are harming women in this way? Or how do we provide spaces even to have conversations like this, and knowing that we have people in our church who are going to fall on different sides of this divide? How do we move forward? And I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit to if you can talk to us a little bit about the Episcopal Church, what our formal sort of stance is, which you do talk about in your book.
Yeah.
But then if you have any thoughts about how can a church move forward? How can we be church in this context?
Yeah. So yeah, I just want to say a little bit about your example, because I find that so interesting. Because I think there are a lot of people who go through the ordination process or whatever who we encounter that I think the question should be asked: how do you reconcile being a Christian with this thing that you do for your job?
Right.
Maybe they work for a payday lender.
Wow.
Maybe they work for a company that builds war weapons, for a defense contractor.
Right. Wow. Yeah.
And which is not a blanket condemnation, but I think it's something that the answer may be, I can't, and I just needed a job, and this was one that was available.
Yep.
And I have to put a roof over my head and feed my family, and so this is what I do.
Yeah.
But I think,
well, first of all, you just knocked me down. That's so good. That's so good. Wow.
Yeah. Which of course, I'm a teacher, great. I'm a nurse, great. All the, there are lots of pro-social occupations, but I think more of us than not might have to answer that question at some point for ourselves. How do I reconcile like what I do with my faith. In full disclosure, my dad was a mechanical engineer for a defense contractor
Right.
for many years. And
I did not know that, so you know what you're talking about.
And my husband builds large scale animatronics and puppets for.
How do you reconcile that with your Christianity?
But so the first time my dad went on a tour of my husband's company, he had this look in his eye of like, this is what I could have been doing with my knowledge.
Wow.
My skills. Like I could
have used these skills for good.
Like build to bring joy.
Right, to bring joy, right.
And create art. And I used it to, build things that would kill people in other countries. So,
That's you got me.
But to your question about sort of like what can we do?
Yeah.
The official Episcopal position on abortion is probably quite a bit less liberal than many clergy or parishioners in the church are aware of or realize. And one of my favorite comments when I wrote the book was people contacting me saying, I'm going to tell your bishop that you wrote this book. And I was like, it is exactly in line with the Episcopal position on abortion.
Right.
So
tell him.
Good luck.
Right. Let him know. He's got a signed copy.
Which is that if at all possible, it should try to be avoided, but that it is a decision that should be made between the pregnant person, their family, their clergy person, their doctor, and not interfered with by the government. So I think that's a fairly, in this day and age, a fairly middle of the road position.
Yeah.
The sort of safe, legal, rare position. And one of the complicated things about talking about abortion is that the laws really differ from state to state.
They do.
So in a state like Tennessee, we have a lot of laws that try to get passed every year, trying to limit abortion, putting in things like quote unquote heartbeat bills. And I've been out there kind of protesting those bills, not to say that like abortion is good, but to say the government really shouldn't be making this decision.
Right.
About people's bodies. So kind of what can you do may depend on just sort of the political situation within your state. I don't know. Right. I mean, Ohio also often kind of makes the news for like what the state legislature is doing.
True.
In similar ways to Tennessee. So that's always fun.
But okay. So we have, in a previous email I'd read, or a previous episode I read, the question that was asked sort of sent in an email to me that got me thinking about talking to you in the first place, which was, if our church, our official stance is, if at all to be avoided, should be, we don't think it's great, but also should be, from a legislative standpoint, the choice of a woman, right? Okay, got that. But then how do we reconcile that, the person asked, with like the person, someone in the Episcopal Church working for an organization that is pro, it's not just pro reproductive rights, but it might actually sell, I don't know. I mean, like, how do we navigate that? You've answered that a little bit already with this, but I guess it goes to a larger question for me of just like, how do we appropriately as the church participate in this conversation?
Yeah.
What is an appropriate way for the Episcopal Church to be present rather than absent in this discussion? And I mean, part of me feels like it's stuff like, not to toot our horn, you and me, but I mean, part of it to me is creating spaces where we even have conversations like this that churches aren't having.
Yeah, I mean, I think to that point, like the first episode, I kind of said, like, I like having difficult conversations,
right,
in part because I feel like people are really hungry for them.
yeah,
Especially if they were raised in sort of, in the kind of, not to default to like the stereotype of the Episcopal Church, but kind of the like frozen chosen, WASPy silence, don't talk about, politics, religion, or
no, sure,
or people are often very hungry to have those conversations, and it can be very challenging to foster the spaces for them, and it requires a lot of trust, and you and I have that trust,
right.
But I think that can be sometimes difficult to foster, and I think it needs to happen either in small groups, or I would caution against sort of like a tirade from the pulpit or something.
Right.
Like that.
Should Episcopal churches be openly, actively pro-choice? Like showing up at a parade or a rally or standing in front of a building or I mean, this, you said what you said about the frozen chosen. I mean, like the majority of the people currently that are listening with us right now are people who go to Church of the Redeemer.
Mm-hmm.
And historically, Church of the Redeemer has been a politically and ideologically diverse congregation of people. It's one of the real points of pride of this congregation. It is also one of the reasons I loved this church and I felt comfortable here, because I don't feel that I find myself fitting into the classic sort of designations of conservative or liberal, Republican or Democrat. I don't feel like I fit in anywhere in those places anymore. So being at a church that's got people all across the board is really exciting for me. And Ohio is a swing state, although it hasn't shown that the last couple of elections, or in this last election in particular, but it is a swing state, and you have people who voted for George W. Bush and then turned around and voted for Barack Obama in Ohio. Like, that's real. And then some of them that voted for Obama and then turned around and voted for Trump, and then turned around and voted for Biden. We have people like that in this congregation, right? So knowing that, but and at the same time, have said actively the way that we've kept that diversity is by not talking about politics. And they're right. And it makes me really nervous that we're creating a culture of people who think that the way to be together is by not discussing hard things.
Yeah.
So they're right it's worked so far. It's worked in the sense that people have been able to forge relationships across political barriers through our church. That's real. And those relationships are valuable, and we want to think about them and care about them. And we lose something when we lose those relationships. And also, it makes me really nervous that the only way we know how to forge those relationships across those boundaries is by completely holding things at bay and not talking about them that affect our lives.
Yeah.
So if you have any advice, so I guess what I'm saying, Kara, is if you have any advice for me, you're kind of a radical activist priest, but if you have any advice for me,
like where I end up in the book is like, I was on a podcast with a person who was ideologically opposite of me in this, and yet I was able to say, these are the things we agree on, because we both want to lessen the number of abortions. We both want to make carrying a pregnancy to term a more viable option. And so what does that mean in terms of what we can collaborate on? What can we support together? Maybe it doesn't, probably the things that you can do are not going to look like they're addressing abortion. Maybe it's like having a daycare for, low-income families. Or, honestly, this is kind of maybe going to be unpopular, making sure the kids at your church are getting accurate sexual education. Right. Because they may not be getting it at school, and that's often not a conversation that parents want to have with their own.
I 100% did not get accurate sexual education growing up. And I was a private school, Christian school, church connected to it, church every Sunday, raised by parents who talked to me about things. And that was never the conversation.
Yeah.
I learned about it from television and the magazines that my brothers hid.
Right. And now
that's not the way you want to learn.
Yeah. And now kids are getting it from the internet and porn,
which they can access better than we ever could.
Yeah.
They can find things that we didn't even know, couldn't have imagined, and they can find them like that.
Yes.
So we have to be in the conversation.
Yes. Yes.
And why would we not want Jesus in the middle of our conversations about these things?
Yeah.
Right? Like, why would we not? That's the thing that I keep coming back to for my siblings in Christ at the church is, what's the part of your life over which Jesus is not Lord?
Mm-hmm.
Let's talk about like which part of your life is Jesus not Lord over as a Christian. And like Hauerwas says, right? When people say Jesus is Lord, but that's just my opinion, man. Like, that's not what those are contradictions of terms. Like, is Jesus Lord? Then what does it look like for him to be Lord of your life?
Mm-hmm.
And that includes your body, that includes your understanding of sex, and that includes your understanding of politics. So why are we not faithful to God in these areas as a community? That's my question. And I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, and I think that's the like really important theological basis to these conversations that we can have, and that makes our faith more relevant.
Yep.
Because it's not just something that we do on Sundays. And I think where the abortion conversation gets held up is like, well, these are just opinions that I hold, rather than sort of how we're living our life and our values.
Right.
And if we're really living out those values, what does that start to look like?
Yep.
And it's hard. Like, I'm not saying I have all the answers or I do it well, or
I mean, I'm not having you back on if you don't have all the answers, Kira. That is...
I mean, every time I order from Amazon, I'm like, I probably shouldn't be ordering from Amazon.
Right. No, yeah, right. It's when people rail against Facebook on Facebook.
I know.
This social media stuff's terrible. Who are you telling? Or like someone's like, put down your phone, like something on Facebook about people needing to put down their phones. And I'm like, I'm reading this on my phone. How did you think I was going to see this note? But anyways, you're right. It is tricky. It's for me an ongoing conversation. In the last 2 years, we have begun the work of talking about racial justice, healing, and reconciliation at Church of the Redeemer. And we've gone places in just the last 6 months in the wake of the murders of Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor and George Floyd. Who were all murdered. Like, the idea of even saying that being controversial, it's not controversial. That's what happened.
Lynched in other terms.
And yeah, the lynchings of the public lynchings of the public lynching of George Floyd. My apologies, with George Floyd. We've talked about some things, and when I've used language about talking about systemic racism and white supremacy in America, the only time I've ever cut more flack from parishioners was the time that I wrote something on Facebook where I said, men are responsible for 100% of unwanted pregnancies. That's the thing I've gotten the most flack from for writing on Facebook in the last 5 years, 10 that I can remember, was when I quoted someone, or I might not have quoted, I might have just said it. Men are responsible for 100% of unwanted pregnancies. People wanted to split hairs and go all over the place with it. It's like, prove me wrong. Without a man, is it possible?
Yeah. I guess with God, all things are possible.
Right. I guess with God. Yeah. Right. I mean, that's
given our lectionary for this week.
That's fair. I do. My sister-in-law, who's married to a Lutheran pastor, she gave me a shirt for Christmas one year that's got a picture of Mary holding Jesus, and it says abstinence 99.99% effective. So there is that one time we grant, right? So Leslie's getting into questions that we're going to need to tackle next week. And we are going to open it up. I think, hey, Kira, will you come back next week? I promise to be on time.
I think I can do that. Yeah.
Okay. I'll be on time.
Okay.
I'll put it on my calendar. Leslie's asking a question that we're not going to answer today because we've gone for an hour. We're 15 minutes over. Hobby Lobby and others won't cover employees' birth control because they're Christian. How does that make sense? I think it's a good question. I mean, I think you're not rolling your eyes because you think it's a bad question. I think you're rolling your eyes because you're like, yeah, seriously.
Yeah.
But I think it's I have some questions about that, and I would love to talk with us about that. So guys, we're gonna have Kira back. I'm gonna keep inviting her back until she says no, I think, because it's just way too much fun. Leslie asks, was Jesus unwanted? I feel like he was more of a surprise than unwanted. So and next week, can we just talk about Mary a little bit?
Oh, for sure. I love talking about Mary.
Well, and I'm learning. I'm developing, I'm 41 years old and I'm finally developing a relationship with the Queen of Heaven. So we're going to talk about Mary next week. I'd like to talk a little bit about how we what Leslie, if you can remember your question, maybe cut and paste it and send it to me privately, and I'll have it on my Facebook Messenger. Let's talk about those things. Kira, what have you been listening to?
Well, you probably know this. I am a big Taylor Swift fan.
I didn't know that about you, but I'm psyched to hear it. Now, does she live in Nashville?
I think she probably has a home here.
Sure. Who doesn't? Right. I mean, I don't, but yes. Okay. She put out a new album.
She did. So
two in 9 months.
I have been listening to, I mean, Folklore is just so good.
It's a good album.
Evermore is, pretty good. I'm sort of still digesting it. So.
What, the new one?
Mm-hmm.
What's it called?
Evermore.
Okay. And she did like an alternate version of Folklore that just came out like a month ago.
Yeah, she's like re-recorded some stuff. So she lost her whole catalog, basically. She lost all of her recordings to her record label. And in a dispute with her record label. And she is now re-recording all of her old catalogs. So that's really exciting.
Okay.
Anyway, I know it's one of the most basic white girl things about me, but
I don't understand. Taylor Swift should not be a controversial figure. Like just get on board. And by the way, if you don't love her music, that's okay.
That's fine.
You can not love someone's music and then just shut the F up about them. You don't have to also have an opinion. It's not a hot take to have an opinion about every single thing that you don't like Taylor Swift doing.
Right.
Because if you're doing it's like every time, like again, we don't do this with men.
Yeah, it is hard to not see that as very gendered.
It's very gendered. And it brings out some of the worst in men, and it brings out some of the worst in the sexual dynamics where women can be the meanest to women.
Oh yeah.
In defense of something. I've seen feminists go after Taylor Swift. I've seen the woke brigade go after her.
Mm-hmm.
Well, she's for trying wrong.
Yeah.
She's very clearly trying. She's also like incredibly well-adjusted for a person who, I'm not saying she's well-adjusted all like full stop, but she's definitely well-adjusted for someone who has been famous for the bulk of her life.
Yeah.
And monstrously famous for the bulk of her life.
I would highly recommend the Netflix documentary.
We haven't watched it yet, or no, it's on Disney Plus too, I think.
Yeah. the Long Pond Sessions.
Yes.
Where she talks about.
Oh, but there's a Netflix documentary from her from last year. Okay. Yeah.
Because as somebody who is, I'm a few years older than she is, but have been a fan of hers for most of her career.
Right.
To have watched her grow both as a person and an artist, I think is a real gift. Like oftentimes that's difficult to let people see.
Right.
And I'm a trained classical singer, so I think as in her earlier years, I was a little judgy about her singing.
Sure.
And I really feel like she has actually literally found her voice. Like,
I love that
voice.
I love hearing you say that. I don't know if you're right, but I love hearing you say it. I don't know her well enough. I mean, I've listened to 1989 and I've listened to Folklore, and I really haven't delved beyond that. And I need to. I'm interested. It's just, when do you do it?
Yeah.
Leslie talks a little bit about some controversies around her art. around the possibility for stealing art for her records and not acknowledging it. That's very possible. That's again, so I'll look into that so that I can decide how to judge her. This past week, my daughter and I watched Black is King, Beyonce's music film that's on Disney Plus. We had some interesting conversations that she brought up about what is appropriate for a woman to wear. And I found myself as the dad saying to the daughter, she's like, I'm worried that what she's wearing is inappropriate. So you know what? That's a teaser. I want to talk with you about that next week and see how I did with my response.
Yeah.
But we watched the whole thing and she really ended up loving it. And I did too. Sturgill Simpson is also re-recording some of his music, but he's doing it with like a bluegrass backing band. I've been digging into that. Gillian Welch has put out a trove of unreleased music from the last 2 decades, and I've been listening to that. And then I listen to a ton of Christmas music.
Yes.
So Emmylou Harris's Christmas album is amazing. If you don't know it, now you know it. What are your Christmas go-tos?
So this year I've been listening to a lot of Over the Rhine Christmas.
Yes.
stuff.
You know they're from Cincinnati, right?
Yes.
Okay, good. Oh my gosh. Okay.
There for you.
Thank you. I have an Over the Rhine story I will save for next week, but I have an Over the Rhine story for you. You're going to love it. It's going to blow your mind. Okay. What else? And they do Christmas shows here. Not this year, but they do like Christmas shows here, and it's a huge deal. Anyway, so okay, what else? Over the Rhine.
I mean, in terms of like more recent stuff, I love like Leslie Odom Jr.'s.
Okay.
I've sort of like reached, I think all of the Christmas albums that need to be recorded have been recorded.
Oh,
like,
yeah. Oh,
I feel like we don't need more.
That's 100% true. That's 100% true. Now that Bob Dylan has made a Christmas album, I agree with you completely. Because he's snuck in.
But I feel like I always like, I'm like, oh, this band that I kind of like made a Christmas album. And then it's not good. It's not good.
When they're good though. So my friend my friend Jerica clued me into Alan Jackson's second Christmas album.
Oh.
And it's quite good. And I'd never heard it before now.
I feel like country music artists do Christmas albums well.
Country music artists and oftentimes Black artists, because they usually come from families that, actually believe in Jesus. Right. I love Bob Dylan's Christmas album, and it is very controversial because a lot of people really hate his voice, and it's recent. So it's at a time when people really hate his voice. But I love it. I love his voice so much. And he literally sings the first verse of "O Come All Ye Faithful" in Latin.
Nice.
So yeah, hearing him saying Rega Mandalorum is pretty fantastic. And then Sinatra's Christmas album is a killer for me. It's just from beginning to end is a killer. His version of "I'll Be Home for Christmas," and the Christmas Waltz, which is I've only ever heard him record. But James Brown's Christmas is killer. Santa Come to the Ghetto is amazing. And Otis Redding has 2 Christmas songs you can find. They're worth your time. Okay, we're going to stop. We went way too long. Christmas is here. Next week, we're going to talk about Mary. We're going to talk about birth control. We're going to talk about Over the Rhine. And we're going to talk about whatever else you all bring to the table. So ask us questions, send them to me beforehand or ask us at the time. And again, Kira and everyone else, I apologize for being late, but thank you so much for your patience and your grace. And we're going to stop. Last words, Kira?
Good to be with you all again. And thanks for having me.
Bye, Wallace.
That's Tilda, actually.
Bye, Tilda.
Tilda
all
Smith.
Cats look the same to me. Bye, Tilda. Bye, Wallace. Bye, Kira. All right, we're hanging up. If I learn how.